The congressional hearing room was so tense you could almost hear the heartbeat of democracy itself, echoing off the marble walls. Cameras clicked, papers shuffled, and every seat in that crowded chamber seemed to carry its own story of hope, pride, or quiet frustration. On that bright Washington morning, two women sat across from each other who could not have been more different. Representative Nancy Mace, sharp-tongued, confident, seasoned in front of the spotlight, and Representative Jasmine Crockett, calm, deliberate, a lawyer who believed facts speak louder than fury. The crowd had no idea that in the next hour, they were about to witness one of the most unforgettable exchanges ever caught on Capitol Hill. The air hummed with electricity as Chairman Davis called the session to order. "This hearing will come to order," he announced, his gavel striking like thunder across the room. Reporters leaned forward, pens ready. The hearing, officially, was about election security, but everyone could sense it was about much more. Truth, credibility, and the raw clash between experience and ego. Nancy Mace started strong. She leaned into her microphone, her tone light but dripping with challenge. The kind of tone that says, "I'm not just talking to you, I'm performing for the cameras." She painted a picture of states running elections perfectly fine, without federal interference, of proud traditions, of independence and efficiency. Her voice carried a rhythm that drew nods from some, polite smiles from others. But Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She sat perfectly still, her notes spread before her in neat, color-coded stacks. Every figure, every quote, every line had been checked and cross-checked. For 15 long minutes, she listened without blinking, as Mace dismissed her concerns as theoretical and laughable. Then came the moment that would replay across millions of screens. Mace leaned back, gave a small theatrical laugh, and said, "Representative Crockett, I find it entertaining that someone who's been in Congress for barely a year thinks she understands election security better than those of us who've actually implemented these systems at the state level. Perhaps in Texas, they do things differently, but in the real world, these concerns are frankly laughable." The room went silent. That laugh, that line, cut through the air like a blade. Even the reporters stopped typing. For 3 full seconds, Jasmine Crockett did not move. Her eyes didn't flicker. Her breath was steady. And then, slowly, she reached for her microphone. "Representative Mace," she began, her voice calm but firm, each syllable carrying weight. "Before entering Congress, I served as the chief election law attorney for Dallas County, overseeing security protocols for 800 polling locations and 2.6 million registered voters. I personally drafted and defended the very security measures you're attempting to describe. So, while I appreciate your enthusiasm, I would suggest that when discussing the real world of election security, you might want to verify your facts before questioning the expertise of those who've actually built these systems from the ground up." The impact was immediate. Gasps rippled through the room. A photographer's flash went off like lightning. The smile faded from Mace's face. Even Chairman Davis looked momentarily speechless. What had just happened wasn't political theater. It was a collision between confidence and competence. And competence had won the round. Viewers watching the live stream could feel it too. Within minutes, clips began circulating online. But in that moment, inside the hearing room, no one moved. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply straightened her papers and waited for the chairman to continue. It was a masterclass in composure, and people noticed. Yet, this was only the beginning. The story of Jasmine Crockett wasn't just about one sharp reply. It was about years of preparation that led to this point. She wasn't a politician who stumbled into a good moment. She was a professional who had lived her subject matter. Before politics, she had spent a decade deep in election law. She had faced judges, county officials, and skeptical voters. She had seen the system up close, the mistakes, the strengths, the vulnerabilities, and had turned those lessons into policy. When she spoke, she didn't rely on talking points. She relied on data. That's why when she walked into the hearing that day, she carried not just confidence, but evidence. Her binder wasn't filled with speeches. It was filled with proof. Across the table, Nancy Mace had her own story, and that's what made the moment even more fascinating. Mace wasn't just a showboat. She was one of the toughest Republicans on Capitol Hill, the first woman to graduate from the Citadel's Corps of Cadets, a survivor in a system that didn't make room easily for women with opinions. Her rise through politics had been fast, sharp, and calculated. She'd built her reputation as a reformer, a fighter, and someone who could deliver a soundbite that burned through news cycles. But in that hearing, her confidence met an equal and opposite force. For once, the stage wasn't hers. The irony was, both women believed in the same principle, protecting democracy. They just saw different paths to it. As Crockett began her presentation earlier that morning, she hadn't intended to spar with anyone. She wanted to talk about data, how inconsistent election standards across states created real vulnerabilities. She wanted to show charts comparing verification systems, case studies on ballot custody, and patterns in voter ID impact. But she also knew that passion sometimes disguises itself as volume, and that loud confidence can't stand against calm evidence for long. That's why, when Mace tried to interrupt her, Crockett simply paused, waited, and continued as if the interruption didn't exist. That small act, refusing to be derailed, changed the energy in the room. Her voice never rose, but her words did all the work. She said, when one jurisdiction fails to secure its process, it doesn't just hurt that state, it shakes confidence in the entire system. The way she said, the entire system, made even her opponents listen. Her experience as a lawyer came through. She was building a case, not picking a fight. As she spoke, she projected data on the screens, colorful, simple visuals that showed the gaps between states, the weaknesses in chain of custody verification, the outdated systems still in use in some counties. These aren't partisan differences, she said softly. They are security risks. People leaned in. Mace, however, couldn't resist responding. She leaned forward, interrupting. Representative Crockett, states have run elections successfully for generations. We don't need Washington telling us how. But Crockett replied, with respect, modern threats aren't the same as they were a generation ago. Cyber attacks, data manipulation, foreign interference, they don't stop at state lines. Every sentence was clean, short, and factual. It wasn't just an argument. It was education. The audience could feel the contrast between the two. One woman talked about ideals. The other explained how the system actually worked. As their exchange deepened, tension thickened. When the discussion turned to voter ID, Mace delivered her favorite line, "Strict photo ID prevents fraud without suppressing votes." It was a statement she'd said countless times before. Crockett, however, had the numbers. Over the past 20 years, she said, there have been 31 proven cases of voter impersonation fraud nationwide. That's roughly 1.5 cases per year. But hundreds of thousands of voters have been turned away for lacking acceptable identification. The hearing room shifted. People murmured. It wasn't emotion that won that moment. It was math. Still, Mace wouldn't back down. Her face tightened. Her tone sharpened. The back and forth grew faster, the tension higher, until that fateful moment when she dismissed Crockett with a laugh. That single sound, theatrical, mocking, did what hours of argument couldn't. It revealed the difference between performance and preparation. When Crockett delivered her now famous reply, it wasn't rehearsed. It came from truth. The room froze. because everyone recognized authenticity when they heard it. Afterward, even her critics had to admit it. She didn't humiliate Mace. She educated her. But the power of that hearing didn't end in that one exchange. It marked the start of something bigger. A rare moment when Congress remembered what it was supposed to be. A place where facts mattered more than flash. Over the following hours, as questions continued, the atmosphere changed. Members who had been leaning toward Mace's side began turning to Crockett for clarification. "Representative Crockett," one asked, "how do we balance access with security?" And she answered, not with slogans, but with solutions, explaining how she had once reduced voting line times from 12 minutes to 4 by redesigning verification steps. It was practical, grounded, real. Even Mace began to adjust. Her tone softened. She asked about hybrid paper-digital systems, about QR verification codes, about cross-checks. It wasn't surrender, it was respect. The viewers who tuned in expecting drama got something deeper, a masterclass in how humility can follow heat. As Crockett spoke, she didn't attack. She invited. She used simple phrases. Let's find what works. Security and access can coexist. Data isn't partisan. Phrases that older viewers, people who had lived through decades of political noise, found refreshing. This wasn't noise. This was clarity. Outside, social media exploded. Clips spread. Headlines multiplied. And suddenly Jasmine Crockett was trending. Not for a soundbite, but for sound judgment. News anchors replayed her calm delivery again and again, calling it the moment expertise fought back. But inside that hearing room, she was still just answering questions, page by page, clause by clause. Every answer backed by evidence. As Chairman Davis extended the session, something rare happened. People listened. And by the end of that long day, what started as confrontation had begun turning into cooperation. Yet the story didn't end there, because what would follow in the next session would test both women again, forcing them to decide whether pride or progress would guide them. The nation had seen them clash. What no one knew was that the days ahead would reveal something far more powerful than rivalry, something that could change how America viewed its leaders forever. To see what happens when conviction meets collaboration. Don't miss part 2. It's where everything changes. The next morning, the headlines across America were filled with images from that hearing. Clips played again and again on television, showing the moment when the Texas Congresswoman calmly answered the South Carolina representative's laughter with facts that no one could deny. People from every state were talking about it. Some called it a clash of wills. Others said it was the first time in a long time they had seen real substance in Congress. Outside the Capitol, news crews waited for reactions. The South Carolina representative walked past them without comment, her jaw tight, eyes forward. She wasn't used to being on the defensive. Inside her office, aides whispered about damage control, about tweets, about strategy. Yet something inside her kept replaying the scene. Not the embarrassment, but the line about verifying your facts. It echoed in her mind because deep down she respected accuracy. She had always prided herself on getting the details right. Across the hallway, the Texas Congresswoman sat at her desk surrounded by papers. She wasn't celebrating. She had seen too many viral moments fade like sparks. What mattered wasn't winning an argument, but fixing the system. Still, she couldn't ignore the flood of messages filling her inbox. Emails from election officials thanking her for speaking with clarity. Volunteers offering support. Journalists requesting interviews. Her staff urged her to go on cable news that night, but she refused. "Let's stay focused," she said softly. "We're not done yet." The next day the committee reconvened, and the atmosphere felt different. Cameras still flashed, but the tension had shifted. The South Carolina representative arrived early, prepared with fresh documents. When the Texas Congresswoman entered, There was a brief glance between them. Not friendly, not hostile, just aware. Chairman Davis called the hearing to order. Today we'll continue discussion on Section 312, he said. I hope we can build on yesterday's productive dialogue. The word productive hung in the air like an invitation. The first to speak was the South Carolina representative. Her voice, usually sharp, sounded measured. Yesterday's discussion raised valid points, she began. I've reviewed our state's latest procedures, and I believe we can refine this bill without undermining local authority. The room stilled. Even reporters looked up from their screens. It wasn't surrender. It was evolution. The Texas Congresswoman nodded slightly, acknowledging the gesture without gloating. Thank you, she said. That's exactly what this process should be. Finding what works. She then opened a binder thick with color-coded tabs. Section 312 focuses on provisional ballots. Right now it's too rigid. What if we change the language to emphasize outcomes instead of steps? Something like, each jurisdiction must ensure verified custody through multi-factor methods, rather than listing every single procedure. The chairman leaned forward. That could provide flexibility while maintaining security, he murmured. The South Carolina representative looked at the proposed wording, tracing it with her pen. Multi-factor verification, she repeated. That means chain of custody logs, dual witnesses, digital timestamps. All options, right? Exactly, the Texas Congresswoman said. It lets each state choose how to meet the standard. What followed was no longer a battle, but a workshop. They traded suggestions, adjusted phrases, and debated definitions. At one point, they even laughed when an aide accidentally projected the wrong draft on the screen. The committee, once split by party lines, found itself nodding in agreement more than arguing. Viewers watching the live stream saw something rare. Lawmakers actually listening to one another. Outside the chamber, journalists scrambled to rewrite their scripts. The headline they had prepared, "Fiery Rivalry Continues." No longer fit. By lunchtime, collaboration emerges after clash was trending instead. Meanwhile, in the hallways, staffers whispered that something had shifted in the culture of the committee. For the first time in months, Democrats and Republicans were eating lunch at the same table, scribbling notes on shared notepads. The change started small but felt real. Later that afternoon, when the Texas Congresswoman spoke about balancing security with access, the South Carolina representative nodded and added, "Agreed, and transparency is equally critical." It was a small moment, but for those watching, it felt historic. After the hearing ended, the two women found themselves walking toward the elevators at the same time. For a few seconds, they stood side by side in silence. Then the South Carolina representative broke it. "You caught me off guard yesterday," she said quietly. The Texas Congresswoman smiled faintly. "You caught me off guard too. I didn't expect you to listen today." They both laughed. Not loudly, but enough to ease the tension. "Maybe we should actually work on that amendment together," the South Carolina representative suggested. "It might shut the critics up. Or make new ones," the Texas Congresswoman replied. "Either way, it'll make better policy." From that day forward, they began meeting privately with staff to draft what would later be called the Performance Standards Amendment. They argued, negotiated, and rewrote sentences late into the night. Every word mattered. The goal was simple but revolutionary. Create national security benchmarks without dictating how states must achieve them. It was practical, flexible, and rooted in real experience. The process wasn't smooth. At one session, the South Carolina representative slammed her notebook shut in frustration. "You're asking states to trust Washington," she said. "That's a hard sell back home." "Then don't ask for trust," the Texas Congresswoman answered. "Show results." That line softened her opponent's glare. Slowly, respect began to replace rivalry. The turning point came when they visited an election center together in Virginia. Reporters trailed behind as they watched poll workers demonstrate chain of custody procedures. The South Carolina representative asked tough questions. The Texas congresswoman filled in technical details. By the end of the tour, they were exchanging notes instead of barbs. "You were right about the gap between collection and counting," the South Carolina representative admitted. "We fixed it last year, but never updated the manual. That's the problem with manuals," the Texas congresswoman said, smiling. "They always tell yesterday's story." Their shared laughter was caught on camera and aired that evening. Viewers who had watched their fiery confrontation just days earlier now saw them side by side, touring equipment, nodding in agreement. The clip went viral again, but this time for hope. People commented that maybe Congress could still work. In the following weeks, the amendment took shape. Draft after draft moved through staff review. Technical experts were consulted. Lawyers refined the wording, and auditors tested the procedures. When it finally reached the committee table, it was solid. The chairman praised both women for turning confrontation into cooperation. The vote passed with broad bipartisan support. Applause filled the room, a sound rarely heard anymore in Washington. But beyond the applause, the story reached millions of citizens who had grown weary of endless division. They saw two leaders choosing results over rhetoric. News outlets called it the day common sense returned. On talk shows, commentators compared it to moments from decades ago when lawmakers still found middle ground. Yet, behind the public smiles, both women knew this was only the beginning. The bill still had to pass the full House, then the Senate. Opposition was waiting. Lobbyists, pundits, partisans who thrived on outrage. Late one evening, as the Capitol dome glowed under the night sky, the Texas congresswoman looked out her office window. Her aide asked if she was nervous. "Not nervous," she said. "Just aware every compromise has a cost." Across town, the South Carolina representative gave a radio interview. When asked about her new partner across the aisle, she paused. "We disagree on plenty," she said, "but she knows her stuff, and I can respect that." Those words spread almost as quickly as their earlier clash. It was another kind of viral, one that carried optimism instead of outrage. As the final committee report was prepared, a senior staffer remarked, "This will outlast both of them." He was right. The amendment would soon influence not just election policy, but the way lawmakers approach complex issues. Still, before the vote could happen, a new challenge emerged. A prominent commentator released a segment accusing the compromise of watering down state sovereignty. Social media lit up again, this time with angry posts and misinformation. The temperature in Washington rose overnight. Both offices were flooded with calls, some supportive, some furious. Old allies warned the South Carolina representative that she was betraying her base. Colleagues told the Texas congresswoman she was being naive to trust anyone across the aisle. Under the pressure, even their growing friendship began to strain. In a late-night meeting, surrounded by empty coffee cups and stacks of drafts, the South Carolina representative said, "Maybe we pushed too far." The Texas congresswoman looked at her steadily. "And maybe we didn't push far enough." Silence filled the room. They both knew that the next hearing could undo everything they had built. Outside, cameras were already setting up. Reporters whispered about tension, betrayal, and politics as usual. But inside that quiet office, two women faced the harder choice. Not between right and left, but between courage and comfort. When dawn broke over the Capitol, they walked together toward the hearing room once again, unsure of how the vote would go, but certain that the fight for integrity was far from over. The next hearing began under brighter lights and heavier expectations. The hall was packed again, every seat filled, every camera ready. People wanted to know if the fragile cooperation between the Texas Congresswoman and the South Carolina representative would survive the growing storm outside. The chairman opened with a warning. Let's remember why we're here, to protect the vote. But even before he finished, reporters were already typing. The air felt thick with judgment. The first questions were harsh. Some lawmakers accused the new amendment of being too soft. Others of being too strict. One shouted, "You've given Washington too much power." Another snapped back, "You've ignored national security." The noise rose until the chairman's gavel slammed down. Then, in that hush, the South Carolina representative leaned forward. "I helped write this," she said, her voice low but firm. "And I did it because it makes our system safer." She spoke of chain of custody logs, of real voters she had met who feared their ballots would vanish into machines. "This amendment means they'll see proof their votes are counted," she said. The room quieted. Then the Texas Congresswoman took the mic. "We've all talked about trust," she began. "But trust isn't built by speeches. It's built by standards. Every voter, red or blue, deserves to know the system works." Her words were simple, direct, human. For a moment, no one interrupted. They looked across the table at each other, two rivals turned partners, and both nodded. The vote began. One by one, names were called. "Aye." "Nay." "Aye." "Aye." The list grew, tension thick as fog. When the clerk read the final count, the chamber erupted. The amendment passed with bipartisan support. The chairman smiled, almost incredulous. "The measure is adopted." Applause filled the hall. Not polite applause, but the kind that bursts out when people realize they've just witnessed something rare. Reporters sprinted for the exits. Staffers hugged. Even some skeptics stood to shake hands. The South Carolina representative exhaled slowly, a mix of relief and disbelief. "You did it," she whispered. "We did it," the Texas Congresswoman corrected. Cameras flashed as they stood side by side, signing the final copy. That image would circle the country. Two women from opposite sides of the aisle, proving that debate doesn't have to mean destruction. Outside, under the bright Washington sun, they faced microphones again, but this time together. "Today isn't about victory," the Texas Congresswoman said. "It's about voters. It's about responsibility," added the South Carolina representative. Their words hit differently now, because they were living proof that cooperation could still exist. Across America, millions watched. Some cried, some smiled. Many simply felt something they hadn't felt in years. Hope that the system could still work. Weeks later, the full bill passed both chambers, carrying the amendment intact. Analysts called it a landmark in bipartisan reform. But for the two women, it was more personal. They had walked through confrontation, humiliation, pressure, and risk, and come out the other side with mutual respect. When asked later what changed, the Texas Congresswoman said, "We stopped talking about who's right and started talking about what's right." The South Carolina representative agreed. "Sometimes the hardest thing isn't fighting your opponent," she said. "It's listening to them." As months turned into years, the story of their hearing became a lesson shown in classrooms and civic workshops. A reminder that courage isn't always loud and progress isn't always flashy. It often starts with a moment when one person chooses respect instead of ridicule. And that's where this story ends. A moment that began with laughter, ended with legislation. A rivalry turned into reform. Two leaders proved that even in the noisiest times, reason can still win. If this story moved you, take a second right now. Hit that like button so more people see that teamwork still matters. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss stories that show the real heart behind the headlines. And in the comments below, tell us what you think. Can respect really fix politics? Your voice keeps these stories alive. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.